like a maze. What should we talk about today?
Love.
Love. That's a good, yeah. The love is good. So, our series for this year is One Humanity, Many Stories. And it's very interesting. So I immediately, when I saw that in January, thought, oh, it's a great opportunity for people in our community to share their stories. And I thought, I should kick it off. And apparently my ego was involved because the universe said, no, I don't think so. So instead, Andrea kicked it off. And then February rolled around and I thought, I should talk. Spirit was like, no, I don't think so. And so I settled in and just said, all right, it's okay if I don't share my story. I get to be center stage most of the time. It's really okay. And then some events conspired that really put it on my heart that it was time for me to speak. One of those was that Justin Gatton had just gotten out of treatment, and his parents had, his mother had asked me to speak with him. And I specifically wanted to invite him to this service so that he could be here, because I wanted him to hear that there is not that much difference between any of us, and that there is always hope. And then Justin didn't make it to the service. He had a prior appointment and left us much earlier than planned. He passed away this past week, and I had the honor and privilege of doing his service. And it became very clear to me during the week that it was very important for me to share my story, with or without Justin being present. And I'm pretty sure he's here now. So it's interesting, when I was born, my daily word, the daily word for my birth date is joy. Now, for those of you who know me now, that's not really probably any big surprise to you. That I can tell you that there have been many times that my life was anything but joyful. Now, my mother will tell you I came into this world with both feet on the ground running. I had things to do, people to see, places to go, and lots of trouble to get into. I would have told you, several years ago, I would have told you that my spiritual journey began on Christmas night in 1988. When a young woman lay in her bed next to the room where her two small children were sleeping and prayed to a God that she didn't believe in, a God that she definitely didn't trust, that she wouldn't wake up. That in her desperation, she could not bear the thought of living one more moment on this earth. And prayed that God would take her life because she didn't have the guts to do it herself. And she was pretty sure she had screwed up so badly that no matter what she did, she probably wouldn't effectively kill herself. And so she wanted God to do it instead. Evidence that God did not answer that prayer, that the universe had other plans. What I know now is that that really wasn't the beginning of my spiritual journey. That my spiritual journey actually began from the time I opened my eyes on this planet. Because as I have gone back and re-examined the story of my childhood, I have discovered that I knew I was divinely blessed. I knew that I was divinely connected. You see, I had a really normal childhood. It was full of trauma, drama, conflict, and adults behaving badly. Normal, right? I've decided that's really normal. And what I realize now is that even in those scary, dark times, even in the midst of all of that, I knew that God was there and that I was a part of that. My family used to tell stories about how imaginative I was and how I had this whole, apparently, family of invisible things that I played with, that I talked to, that I sang to. What I know now is that they were only invisible to them. That I would hide under this huge pine tree that we had in my grandparents' yard, which I discovered when I was in my late 30s was really not all that huge. I thought it towered like the Empire State Building, but then I was 2 or 3. And I would hide underneath this tree. That was my safe place. I would hide from the adults underneath this tree, and I would have conversations with God and with my angels and with my guides and with other light beings. And when I went back a few years ago and rediscovered that I was never a victim, ever. I have never in my life been a victim. I have always been the heroine of my own story. That even in those moments, I was connected. I would sit under that tree and I would sing, and the light would surround me, and I knew that I was something more. I knew that I wasn't this body that was enduring this trauma. I knew that I wasn't this personality that was being told how bad and precocious and wild I was. I knew I was more than that. I knew that there was something in me that was divine and was divinely connected. Unfortunately, that got lost along the way, and it took me a while to reclaim it. My story used to be that I was a square peg trying to fit into a round hole, that I never really quite fit in. And yet I know now that that's not really true either. That everywhere I went there was a party, even little. I could recruit every kid on the block to steal the corn that we would throw on people's porches so their lights would come on. I was that kid. Yes, I lived around a bunch of cornfields. Yeah, you take the corn off the cob and you put it in a little gunny sack, and then you run through the neighborhood and you throw it at people's windows and their doors, and it makes everybody mad, and they come out and they flip their lights on, and you're in the bushes going Walden, Indiana. What can I say? Walden, Indiana. So I wasn't the square peg in the round hole. I had lots of friends. I never met a stranger ever in my entire life. But that was how I felt. I felt that there was something, I got the message that there was something fundamentally wrong with me. That if you really knew who I was, you wouldn't love me. If you really knew how defective I was, you would run instead of be my friend. And so I spent most of my life, my young life, hiding from that, running from it, finding ways to numb that. And I was angry at God from the time I was probably 10, 11, 12. They would go to church, and I would go to church on Sundays, and they would talk about God, and they would talk about God's judgment, and they would talk about that I was a sinner, and I believed all that already, and so it wasn't particularly helpful, and I decided that God had been punishing me since the moment I walked on this earth. And if there was hell, I was already in it, and so what did it really matter? And so God and I had quite a contentious relationship from the time I was about 12 until I was 28. Pretty contentious. I decided that God needed to stay out of my way, that I had it all under control, and that God wasn't of any help anyway. So just get out of my way. And you can imagine my parents were good people. They were Southern Baptists. My dad taught Sunday school. My mom played the organ. We were there every time the doors opened. And I'm sure that they were just didn't really quite know what to do with me. When I was in high school, I was invited to my first party. I was probably 15, 16. I had my first taste of alcohol, and I decided, oh man, that's it. That is it. I found something that at least temporarily took away the pain. I found something that at least temporarily made me feel whole. And all I can tell you is that my addiction took me places that I didn't know existed in my life at home with my parents. That my addiction took me places that I never imagined were possible. And that in the midst of that, there was no light. There really was no light. In the midst of that, I didn't feel connected. I couldn't feel connected to anyone because I was disconnected from source, or so I thought. And when I look back now and see that I am alive and present today, even Jane, who was with me in college, in the midst of my best drinking, even Jane will tell you that I lived through that is just a miracle. Because my life didn't have value, you know? It just really didn't. I did not value my life. It wasn't really important. What was important was that I didn't feel. What was important was that I didn't have to live with the pain, that I didn't have to live with the disconnection, that I didn't have to live feeling like I was unlovable, and so whatever it took. And I can say that I was an indiscriminate user of anything that you told me would make me feel better. Indiscriminate. Anything that came my way, I was willing to try at least once. And that also included using people, using places, anything. Anything that would make me feel a little bit better. I was willing to try at least once. And I had always been that kid from early on that if you said, I dare you, I was up for it. And by the time I was 18, 19, I decided that the law was written for other people. That it didn't necessarily apply to me unless I got caught. And so really there wasn't too much that was beyond me. You know, I can remember having a conversation with Judy Gatton a couple of months ago at a coffee shop. And we were talking about, I also like to collect friends that were worse than me, because then I felt better. And I also like to marry them. And I've had several of those in my life. The kids' father being one. And I was sharing with her that I spent a great deal of energy, when I was sober, I spent a great deal of energy planning his death and figuring out ways that I could murder him and not get caught. And when I made amends to him several years ago, he and I had such a different perception. He was like, you were such a wonderful mother and you were such a good wife. And I was like, dude, I tried to kill you. Like every chance I got. No, no, but you were so kind and you were so loving. Like, no, not really. Remember that time that you like broke your ankle? That's because I pushed you off down the stairs. Like, really? I'm trying to apologize for what I put him through. And he's like, no, really, it was me. Like, no. It takes two sick people to be in a sick relationship. And we had that. What I know now is that God was always there. God was always there. If God had not been there, I wouldn't be here. God was there in every moment. God kept yanking me back from the precipice of death, institutions, and prison, because it didn't go there. And it wasn't of my own doing. And what I know is that my life was actually full of grace. That I received much more than I ever deserved. I was never, ever truly homeless. I wasn't. I never spent a single night out on the street. There was always somebody willing to take me in, to give me money, to help me get on my feet. I was never really even truly hungry. I wasn't beyond stealing to feed my children, but I was never hungry. And I never spent one night locked behind bars. So my life was full of grace. And when I was 28 and I was suicidal, a couple of things had happened. My husband was being prosecuted for molesting my daughter and a dear friend of ours' child, people that we used with. And in the midst of that, all kinds of stuff was coming out about who had drugs and where they had drugs and who was doing what with whom where. We were tangled up in a bunch of stuff. And I really saw no way out but to die. I just really didn't see any way out. Just like it never once occurred to me in my marriage that I could file for divorce like normal people. It just didn't occur to me that that was even possible. And on that night, I asked to die, and I can tell you I was madder than hell when I woke up the next day. I was so angry. Like, I can't even die right. Like, what is this? I can't even die right. And I knew that there was only one solution, and that solution lied in Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I remember going into an AA meeting, and I'd been hanging around the rooms of AA trying to get my husband sober for several years. So they knew me by name. And we were a small group in Karlsruhe, West Germany. And I knew that it was the practice of that group, if everybody was there, that they knew they wouldn't offer chips. So I went into the bathroom, one last opportunity for God to bail me out, and prayed. Now, God, I'm not really an alcoholic. I don't really have a problem. It's that everyone else will not bend to my will. And if everybody else would just straighten up and do what I want, things would be fine. But if I go out and they ask if anyone wants to pick up a white chip, then I'll know that this is my path. And so I went back out to the meeting, and my sponsor would say that I looked very smug, like I had all the answers. And in the midst of that, we proceeded with the meeting. They didn't say anything about chips. I thought I was off the hook. And just 2 minutes before we closed the meeting, a guy stood up and he said, I feel like somebody in this room needs a white chip. And so I picked up my chip. Now, I made an agreement that night when I stood before that group. I told them that I didn't believe in this God that they believed in. That I believed that God was out to get me, and that I'd be okay if I had anything to do with God for the rest of my life. And that if God really had my best interest in heart, he better step up and start showing it. And that was kind of my attitude. And what I can tell you is that my life, even to this moment, has been filled with miracles. That during that time, all of our accounts were frozen by the U.S. government. They wanted to make sure we didn't owe anybody money for the crimes we had committed. And I came home from work one day, and there were 2 sacks of groceries on my doorstep. And I didn't understand, because you see, I'd lost that part of my humanness that felt compassion for other people and did for other people. And I couldn't understand why anyone would just give me groceries and not ask me for anything. I just couldn't imagine it. But I began to open to the fact that maybe I really was lovable. That maybe there was something out there guiding my steps. That just maybe, there was something out there and some reason to live. Fast forward to my first encounter with the call to ministry. So day after day, I got better and better. I discovered I had 2 children. I discovered it was important to get them up on time, to feed them on a regular basis, that they liked that. Put away the sharp objects, I learned how to be a parent. And this ties into the whole creating community. You see, I couldn't be here today if it wasn't for community. First there was this community of presence that watched over me. And then there was the community of AA that took care of me, taught me how to pay bills, how to show up for work, how to take care of my kids, that made sure that I had everything that I needed, whether I thought I deserved it or not. And through AA, I was able to open my heart to a spiritual community. So I became involved in the United Church of Christ, the UCC church, and began to do things like teach Sunday school. I began to hand out bulletins. I became involved in that community, and again, found a place where I could connect to other people who didn't judge me, who loved me just the way I was, no matter how I showed up, just like AA had. And it was during that spiritual community, when I was part of that spiritual community, that I had an experience. It was at Lent, it was this time of year, and we were studying Carolyn Meese's Interior Castle. And I had an experience where I woke up from a vision where I heard God calling me. And I woke up, and it was my first kind of real spiritual sort of experience. And I'm not crying, and I'm weeping, and I'm looking at my partner, and I said, "God's called me into service." I didn't even really know what that meant. And it was very interesting what happened at that time. I went to my minister, who said to me, "Oh, Glenda, God calls people to do all sorts of things. That doesn't mean you're supposed to be a minister." Oh, okay. And then I went to my mother, and my mother said, "Oh, honey," in that great sweet southern voice, "Oh, honey, I don't let people like you be ministers." And then I went home to my partner, and she said, "You can do what you want, but I'm not sticking around." I am not going to be in a relationship with a minister. I don't even want to think what that's going to look like. So I said, okay, I guess I was supposed to be a minister, and I went to graduate school instead and became a therapist. And continued a lifelong search for my connection with God and what it meant to be connected in community, what it meant to be connected to spirit. And followed a guru with my college sweetheart Jane to Colorado. And I tell you, the first time that we met Saima was at a retreat, and she walked into the room and she said, "God loves you." And I started weeping. Like, it was my first realization that that was true, that I was lovable, that all of me was lovable. And it changed my life. And I learned the importance of meditation. I learned the importance of taking time to be quiet and to connect to God consciously every single day of my life. That I need that conscious awareness. Because even today, my head is a dangerous neighborhood. And I really shouldn't go out there without others and a flashlight. I can, even today, think some crazy kind of stuff. So meditation is one way that I learned to connect. 15 years later, after my original call, Jane and I left Colorado and she took me to Missouri. And some of you heard this the weekend that I interviewed. She took me to Missouri, which I promptly named Misery. We were living in Misery. It was in the heart. It was not like Colorado. It was not like my spiritual community. It was not like anything I had experienced, and I was not happy. And in fact, I was so unhappy that at one point Jane said, "Honey, I'll just buy you a plane ticket. Like, you can go back to Colorado. If you're this unhappy, you can go back to Colorado." I was just terribly miserable. And she remembered that when I was in college, I used to receive the daily word. It came anonymously. I'm pretty sure now that my grandmother was the one that sent it to me. But we would, no matter what state of consciousness we were in, every day I would read the daily word to Jane. Like, it was like a ritual to me. Every single day I read the daily word. And so she got on the internet and she said, "You know, they have a church, right?" And I said, No, they just have the daily word. No, it's really a whole group of people. They have churches. And she found a Unity Church in Columbia, Missouri. And she said, "Let's go and see if we can find you some community." And we went, and that very first service, we went into meditation, and a couple of things happened. There was this beautiful banner hanging at the front of the church that said something about love, that we are love. And I was really touched by that. And then it just so happened their guest musicians that weekend were from Colorado. And they sang, "How could anybody ever tell you that you're anything less?" And it was a song that our guru sang to us at the end of every retreat. And so I'm just like sobbing. And I definitely had that "I'm home" kind of feeling. And we went into meditation, and Jane will tell you that when I came out of that meditation, she said I glowed. She said it was like you were like lit up. And I turned to her very quietly and I said, "God said now. Now is the time. And I've been called to be a minister." And unlike the previous time, she turned to me very calmly and said, "Well, of course you are." Of course. I went up to a minister I had never ever met, and I said, "God wants me to be a Unity minister." She said, "Can you meet with me on Monday at 10? I'll get you started." I would love to tell you that it was easy peasy because I was on the path, but it wasn't. It took me a while, a very convoluted kind of path to becoming a minister.